The 20th century began with old empires crumbling, but from the ashes of the Great Depression and World War II, a new superpower emerged. In just a few short years, the United States transformed from an isolationist nation into the center of the world's economic, military, and cultural stage. How did a country once brought to its knees by crisis rise to shape the destiny of the entire planet? Join us as we uncover the remarkable journey that turned America into the modern empire without a crown. Morning breaks across the United States, and it is unlike any morning the nation has ever known. The war has ended, but its echo reverberates in every quiet suburb and every bustling city street. In newly built neighborhoods that only months earlier were farmland fresh, paint glistens on rows of identical houses. Driveways fill with cars as men who once huddled in foxholes or navigated the steel decks of warships climb behind the wheel to begin commutes that feel almost dreamlike. These are the same young soldiers who stared down the Axis powers across Europe and Asia. Now they stare at a future that seems impossibly bright. Universities and colleges hum with a new kind of energy. Returning veterans crowd lecture halls, shoulders still bearing the memory of heavy packs now burdened only by textbooks. Many had never imagined higher education. Now they are enrolled by the thousands, their tuition paid by a grateful government. Classrooms that once whispered with the monotony of peacetime suddenly crackle with ambition and debate. Professors watch as students who have seen the worst of humanity wrestle with philosophy, engineering, and economics as if their very lives depend on it, because in a sense they do. The economy, long shackled by depression, surges like a river after a dam break. Manufacturing roars with the confidence of a nation that has proven it can outproduce any enemy. Private investment, once timid, floods into new industries. Storefronts brim with American-made appliances, gadgets, and gleaming consumer goods. In the span of a few short years, the gray austerity of the 1930s fades into the vibrant color of post-war abundance. Abroad, the American presence is impossible to miss. Servicemen remain stationed from Cuba to Korea, their boots on soil that only recently echoed with artillery. They are both guardians and symbols, watchful sentinels of a new balance of power. The isolationist republic that once recoiled from foreign entanglements now casts a long shadow across oceans and continents. America has become more than a nation. It has become a force. But to understand the magnitude of this transformation, one must look backward. Less than 2 decades earlier, the country had been on its knees. Breadlines stretched around city blocks. Banks collapsed like sandcastles against a rising tide. Ordinary families sold heirlooms for scraps of coal. The story of how a struggling democracy emerged from that abyss to stand as one of 2 global superpowers is not merely economic. It is human, fraught with bold experiments, bitter mistakes, and relentless reinvention. This is the dawn of the American century, when the ordinary became extraordinary almost overnight. It is a story of a sleeping giant roused a people who refused to remain small, and a land that transformed its suffering into strength. To see the present clearly, we must trace the path from despair to dominance, from the quiet desperation of the Great Depression to the confident stride of a nation ready to shape the world. Before the suburbs bloomed and the factories hummed, the United States staggered under a weight that seemed impossible to lift. The year was 1929, when the stock market collapsed in a frenzy of panic and speculation. In a matter of days, fortunes vanished and the illusion of endless prosperity dissolved like smoke. Ordinary families watched as years of careful savings disappeared, while powerful bankers and investors tumbled from penthouses to breadlines. What followed was not a brief correction, but a grinding calamity. Banks failed in waves, their locked doors a cruel symbol of lost trust. Farmers faced parched soil and markets that paid pennies for a bushel of grain. Once proud factory towns fell silent, their smokestacks rusting against gray skies. By 1933, 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed. People lined up for soup kitchens and clung to any rumor of work. Children felt hunger as a daily ache. Fathers left home in search of any job, any wage, any chance to feed their families. In desperation, President Herbert Hoover sought to protect American industry through the 1930 Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. The idea was simple: raise tariffs so high that foreign goods became too expensive, forcing Americans to buy domestic products and reviving homegrown businesses. But what seemed logical on paper proved disastrous in reality. Other nations retaliated, slapping their own tariffs on American exports. International trade collapsed by an astonishing 65%. Instead of healing the economy, the Tariff Act deepened the wound, isolating the United States at the very moment cooperation might have eased the suffering. Banks toppled not only in America but across Europe, sending shockwaves through an already fragile global economy. In towns from Ohio to Oklahoma, people watched their savings evaporate overnight. Family farms were auctioned off for pennies to pay debts. In city streets, newspapers became blankets for those sleeping rough. The myth of the invincible American economy lay shattered. Then, in March 1933, a new voice emerged from the radiostatic Franklin Delano Roosevelt, speaking with the steady confidence of a man who believed that action bold and immediate could pull a nation back from the brink. His words, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," became a lifeline for millions who had known nothing but fear for years. Roosevelt's New Deal was not a single program, but a sweeping experiment in recovery. He moved quickly to stabilize the banking system, creating the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to protect ordinary depositors. The very act of guaranteeing bank accounts restored a fragile trust. Americans could finally place their savings without dreading a locked door the next morning. He launched the Social Security program, promising dignity to the elderly and disabled who had been left destitute. Through massive public works projects, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, he put men and women to work, building roads, dams, schools, and parks. Across the country, idle hands found purpose again, shaping the physical landscape while reclaiming personal pride. These measures stitched a safety net where none had existed, and for countless families, they meant survival. Yet even as the economy began a slow crawl upward, the underlying wounds ran deep. Unemployment remained stubbornly high. The private sector hesitated to invest. Relief checks and work programs alleviated suffering but could not spark the roaring growth the nation longed for. Still, the psychological shift was profound. Roosevelt proved that government could act as a shield when markets failed, that collective effort could counter despair. Fireside chats crackled through living rooms, giving distant farmers and weary city dwellers the sense that their president spoke directly to them. The New Deal did not end the Great Depression, but it rekindled faith that the nation's democratic experiment could endure. As the 1930s progressed, storms gathered far beyond America's shores. In Europe and Asia, authoritarian regimes flexed their muscles, Hitler consolidating power in Germany, Mussolini marching through Ethiopia, Japan expanding across East Asia. The world edged toward a conflict that would make the Great War seem almost quaint by comparison. Inside the United States, memories of the First World War's carnage still lingered, and isolationist sentiment ran deep. Most Americans wanted no part in foreign wars. Congress passed neutrality acts designed to keep the country out of Europe's rising flames. Yet across the Atlantic and Pacific, events moved with a force no law could contain. By the late 1930s, it became increasingly clear that America's future could not be sealed off from the world's turmoil. The very industries revived by New Deal programs would soon be called upon to produce not just consumer goods, but weapons of war. The United States was like a vast engine idling in low gear, powerful but not yet fully awakened. When Japanese planes roared over Pearl Harbor in December 1941, that engine roared to life. Overnight, the hesitant giant became a nation united by purpose. Factories converted to wartime production with breathtaking speed. Men enlisted by the millions. Women stepped into roles once closed to them. The Great Depression, which a decade of policy could only partly heal, was finally ended not by legislation, but by the relentless demands of global war. America's path from the despair of 1929 to the determined mobilization of the early 1940s is more than a chronicle of economics. It is a testament to resilience, improvisation, and a willingness to gamble on ideas as audacious as the people who embrace them. The nation that would soon stride onto the world stage as a superpower was forged first in the crucible of hardship, its character tempered by years of doubt, and its spirit hardened by necessity. This is where the story of American transformation truly begins, in the ashes of financial ruin, amid the whispers of breadlines and the echo of shuttered factories. From this bleak soil, the seeds of a new America would take root, ready to burst into full bloom when war called and the sleeping giant awakened. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt took the oath of office in March 1933, the United States teetered on the edge of collapse. Banks were closing by the hour, unemployment hovered near 25%, and the collective spirit of the nation sagged under a decade of unrelenting loss. Roosevelt stepped into the White House like a man striding onto a battlefield. His first 100 days became a whirlwind of legislation and radio addresses that sought not merely to repair a broken economy, but to rescue the very idea of American possibility. Roosevelt's approach was audacious. Instead of waiting for markets to heal themselves, he declared a nationwide banking holiday 4 days, in which every bank closed its doors while the federal government examined their ledgers. When the banks reopened, those deemed sound carried the backing of the U.S. government. For the first time in years, Americans felt safe depositing their hard-earned cash. The simple act of trust, people lining up to put money back into banks, was itself a victory over fear. Next came a flood of New Deal programs, each with a memorable acronym that became part of daily speech. The Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work planting trees, building trails, and restoring the nation's depleted forests. The Tennessee Valley Authority tamed a region ravaged by floods and poverty, erecting dams that brought both electricity and hope to rural families. Through the Works Progress Administration, artists painted murals, actors performed traveling plays, and laborers paved roads that still carry traffic today. Roosevelt believed that employment was more than a paycheck. It was dignity restored. Equally transformative was the Social Security Act of 1935. For the first time in American history, the elderly, the disabled, and orphaned children had a guaranteed safety net. Payroll taxes funded pensions and unemployment insurance, weaving a layer of security into the national fabric. To citizens who had watched grandparents and neighbors slip into destitution during the Depression, Social Security felt like a covenant, a promise that age or misfortune would no longer mean abandonment. Roosevelt also redefined the relationship between government and the economy through the Securities and Exchange Commission, established to police Wall Street excesses that had fueled the 1929 crash. The Federal Housing Administration offered mortgage insurance, allowing ordinary families to dream of owning homes. Taken together, these measures recast the federal government from a distant referee into an active partner in daily life. Yet the New Deal was never without controversy. Critics on the right denounced it as an experiment in socialism, an overreach that threatened free enterprise. Voices on the left argued it did not go far enough, pointing to persistent unemployment and poverty. The Supreme Court struck down several early programs, forcing Roosevelt to re-engineer key policies. But through it all, FDR's confident voice crackling through the nation's radios reassured millions that progress, however halting, was possible. By the late 1930s, the economy had clawed back significant ground. Unemployment dropped, wages inched upward, and Americans began to believe again in tomorrow. Still, full prosperity remained elusive. The New Deal had stabilized a bleeding economy and reshaped the social contract, but the engine of growth needed a new spark. That spark tragically came from abroad. As Europe darkened under the shadows of fascism, Roosevelt sensed the gathering storm. He strengthened the U.S. military, quietly supporting allies through programs like Lend-Lease, while navigating a public still wary of foreign entanglements. Factories that had lain dormant now hummed with production of planes, ships, and munitions even before America officially entered the conflict. The groundwork for an industrial miracle was being laid plank by plank, rivet by rivet. Then came December 7th, 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor transformed the United States overnight from a cautious observer to an unrelenting combatant. In a single speech to Congress, Roosevelt framed the date, which will live in infamy, as a call to arms. The nation answered with astonishing unity. Within months, production lines that once turned out refrigerators and automobiles were churning out bombers and tanks. Unemployment, which no New Deal measure had fully erased, plunged almost instantly to historic lows. The New Deal's legacy now met the crucible of total war. Agencies that had built dams and roads shifted effortlessly to supplying the arsenals of democracy. The organizational muscle developed during the 1930s, planning vast projects, mobilizing workers, coordinating across states, proved invaluable. Roosevelt's belief that government could direct large-scale action had prepared the nation to meet a global emergency. This was the moment when the United States discovered its true industrial might. Shipyards launched Liberty ships faster than German U-boats could sink them. Aircraft factories delivered thousands of planes each month. The sleeping giant was fully awake, its economy no longer merely recovering, but surging into a new era of unprecedented capacity. Roosevelt would not live to see final victory, but his imprint on the American story was indelible. The New Deal had not only alleviated the worst suffering of the Depression, it had expanded the definition of citizenship itself. Americans now expected their government to be a bulwark in times of crisis and an engine of opportunity in times of peace. As soldiers prepared to cross oceans and workers filled night shifts in humming plants, a quiet but profound transformation had already occurred. The federal government was no longer a distant overseer, but a partner in prosperity. The American people, hardened by deprivation and emboldened by reform, carried a new sense of collective purpose. That sense would prove decisive. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent, the United States emerged not only victorious, but economically ascendant. Its factories intact, its workforce disciplined, its confidence unshaken. The decade of experimentation under Roosevelt had forged a foundation sturdy enough to support a superpower. This was the bridge from the misery of the Great Depression to the astonishing vitality of the post-war boom. America had learned to marshal its resources, to innovate under pressure, and to believe that even in the darkest times, bold action could rewrite destiny. The next chapter, one of explosive growth and global influence, was about to begin. By the early 1940s, the United States was poised on a knife's edge between its isolationist instincts and the undeniable pull of global conflict. When Japanese planes screamed down on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the balance shattered in a single morning of fire and smoke. Within hours, the nation pivoted from wary neutrality to full-throated mobilization. President Roosevelt's address to Congress, a date which will live in infamy, was more than a speech. It was a rallying cry that awakened an industrial and human giant. Factories that once produced household appliances now churned out bombers' tanks and munitions at breathtaking speed. Automobile assembly lines were retooled almost overnight to turn out Jeeps and armored vehicles. Detroit, once the Motor City, became the arsenal of democracy. Across the nation, sirens wailed not in alarm but in celebration of production goals smashed and records broken. In 1939, the United States had ranked a distant 14th in global military power. Within 4 years, it was the world's unmatched industrial powerhouse. This was not just a transformation of machinery, but of people. Men enlisted in staggering numbers, leaving farms and cities to wear the uniform. The draft pulled millions into service, forging a citizen army that reflected every corner of the nation. Yet as men departed for training camps and battlefields, an equally significant mobilization occurred on the home front. Women, long relegated to the domestic sphere, stepped into roles once considered unthinkable. They became riveters, welders, machinists, and engineers, filling the yawning gaps in the workforce with skill and determination. Rosie the Riveter was more than a poster. She was a neighbor, a sister, a mother, her hair tied back with a polka dot scarf, as she guided sheets of metal through a press or tightened bolts on the fuselage of a bomber. Between 1941 and 1945, over 6 million women entered the industrial workforce. Their calloused hands and sleepless nights fueled the engines of victory. The mobilization reached far beyond the factory floor. Farmers increased output to feed not only America, but much of the Allied world. Scientists and engineers raced to develop new technologies from radar to the splitting of the atom itself. Entire cities sprang up around secret projects like the Manhattan Project sites in Oak Ridge and Los Alamos, where the brightest minds labored under a veil of silence to harness forces that would forever change warfare and geopolitics. The economic impact was seismic. In 1940, unemployment still hovered near 15%. By 1943, it had fallen below 2%, a figure almost unimaginable during the grim years of the Depression. Government contracts poured billions into private industry, and wages rose even as price controls kept inflation in check. For many families, the war years brought their first taste of financial security. Savings grew as rationing limited consumer spending, laying the groundwork for the post-war purchasing boom. But the cost was not measured only in dollars. Every victory overseas was purchased with sacrifice at home. Families rationed sugar rubber and gasoline. Children collected scrap metal in tin cans for the war effort. Blackouts along the coasts became a nightly ritual. Nearly every American household bore the weight of an absent father, brother, or son, his photograph pinned beside a blue star flag in the window. Still, the sense of common purpose was intoxicating. For the first time in years, the nation felt united. The ideological divides of the Depression faded before the urgent necessity of survival. Labor strikes subsided as unions pledged a no-strike policy for the duration of the war. Communities organized victory gardens, blood drives, and war bond rallies. Hollywood joined in producing films and newsreels that both entertained and steeled public resolve. Overseas American soldiers fought on multiple fronts, storming beaches in North Africa and Normandy, slogging through the jungles of the Pacific Islands, flying perilous bombing runs over Europe. Their courage and endurance became the living embodiment of the country's industrial might. Each rifle, tank, and aircraft was a testament to the millions back home who had worked double shifts and slept too little to keep the supply lines unbroken. By 1945, the results were undeniable. The United States and its allies stood victorious, though at a staggering human cost. The dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought the Pacific War to an abrupt and terrifying end. With Japan's surrender, the Second World War was over, but something irreversible had occurred. The conflict had not merely ended the Depression. It had catapulted the United States into a position of unprecedented economic and military strength. The transformation was almost surreal. While Europe and Asia lay in ruins, cities reduced to rubble, economies shattered, the United States emerged with its homeland untouched and its factories running at full capacity. It possessed 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, more than half of its industrial output, and a military infrastructure capable of projecting power across the globe. The sleeping giant Admiral Yamamoto had warned about after Pearl Harbor had indeed awakened, and found itself not merely awake, but ascendant. The war also rewove the social fabric. The millions of women who had entered the workforce during the conflict had proven their capability beyond dispute. Though many would be pressured to relinquish their jobs to returning servicemen, their experience planted seeds of a future movement for gender equality. African Americans too had contributed heroically both in combat and in the defense industries, challenging the hypocrisy of fighting for freedom abroad while enduring segregation at home. These tensions would soon ignite the modern civil rights movement. Economically, the United States now stood on a new foundation. Wartime production had spurred advances in technology, logistics, and management that would ripple through civilian industries for decades. The infrastructure of highways, ports, and factories built to supply the war would soon serve a peacetime consumer economy hungry for cars, appliances, and homes. Government spending had proven a powerful engine of growth, reshaping attitudes about the role of federal power in economic life. Perhaps most profoundly, The war redefined America's relationship with the world. Isolationism, once the dominant instinct, seemed not only naive, but dangerous. The oceans that once shielded the continent were no longer barriers in an age of long-range bombers and atomic weapons. The United States had become the linchpin of a fragile new order, its presence essential to rebuilding allies and deterring new threats. As soldiers returned from Europe and the Pacific, they stepped onto a homeland transformed. They came home to bustling factories instead of breadlines, to communities planning new schools and roads rather than struggling to keep the lights on. Many carried the hope of college degrees and home ownership made possible by the GI Bill. The contrast with the grim 1930s could not have been starker. A nation that had once questioned its own survival now bristled with confidence and ambition. The sleeping giant had not only awakened, it had reinvented itself. In the crucible of global war, the United States discovered its immense potential for unity, innovation, and leadership. The depression-scarred country of the early 1930s was gone, replaced by an industrial colossus ready to shape the post-war world. The stage was set for an era of prosperity and influence unlike anything in the nation's history, and for challenges that would test whether this newfound power could be wielded wisely. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the United States emerged from the Second World War not merely victorious, but fundamentally transformed. Across Europe and Asia, cities lay in ruins. London, bomb-scarred; Berlin, reduced to rubble; Tokyo, a wasteland of ash. Yet American cities stood untouched, their skylines unbroken and their factories humming. It was as if a tempest had raged across the globe and spared one vast, resource-rich island. The contrast was astonishing, and it carried profound consequences. The end of the war triggered a sudden shift from the frenzy of wartime production to the question of peacetime purpose. For years, American industry had been dedicated to a single mission: victory. Now the challenge was to convert that vast machinery to consumer needs without losing momentum. Government contracts wound down, rationing ended, and millions of soldiers prepared to trade uniforms for civilian clothes. Economists feared a return to Depression-era unemployment once wartime spending stopped. Instead, the opposite happened. Private investment poured into the economy, eager to meet pent-up demand. Consumers, their savings swelled from years of restricted spending, rushed to buy goods that had been scarce: refrigerators, automobiles, radios, and the new miracle of television sets. Assembly lines that once produced tanks now turned out sedans in gleaming chrome. American families, long accustomed to frugality, suddenly found themselves in a marketplace bursting with possibility. This remarkable transition owed much to the wartime innovations in production and management. Techniques refined for efficiency, mass production methods, logistics, networks, quality control now powered consumer industries. Factories built to supply munitions were easily adapted to manufacture washing machines or kitchen appliances. The United States had become not just a military colossus, but the world's premier manufacturing powerhouse. Victory also brought a powerful sense of national pride and destiny. The United States had faced the gravest threat in modern history and emerged as a decisive force for freedom. From the beaches of Normandy to the islands of the Pacific, American soldiers and sailors had fought with relentless courage. Their triumph imbued the nation with a new identity: protector of democracy, leader of the free world, and increasingly global superpower. This confidence found a symbolic expression in the ultimate act of technological might: the atomic bomb. The devastating attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 not only ended the war with Japan, but also announced in the starkest possible terms that America possessed a weapon unmatched by any other nation. The isolationist America of old, as one commentator wrote, perished in the nuclear flash that ended the Second World War. With that single act, the United States had stepped into a new epoch where its decisions could alter the course of civilizations. But beneath the victory parades and surging economy, challenges simmered. Millions of returning servicemen and women needed jobs, homes, and education. The GI Bill of Rights, signed into law in 1944, offered an ambitious solution: It guaranteed low-interest home loans, unemployment compensation, and funds for college or vocational training. Between 1944 and 1956, nearly 8 million veterans attended universities or trade schools on GI subsidies. Another 2.5 million took advantage of government-backed mortgages, fueling a housing boom unprecedented in scale. The results reshaped the American landscape. Rows of modest but comfortable houses sprang up on the outskirts of cities, forming the new phenomenon of suburbia. Builders like William Levitt mastered rapid construction techniques, turning empty fields into bustling communities almost overnight. Affordable automobiles and a growing highway system made commuting feasible, birthing the culture of the daily drive and cementing America's love affair with the car. The economic and social implications were enormous. Homeownership rates soared, creating a broad middle class with a stake in stability and growth. College education, once the privilege of the elite, became attainable for millions, raising the nation's collective skill level and fueling innovation. Families buoyed by steady employment and rising incomes began to dream bigger vacations, modern appliances, a better life for their children. This was the foundation of the consumer society that would define the post-war decades. Yet the benefits were not evenly shared. For Black veterans, the promise of the GI Bill was often illusory. One key political compromise had left administration of benefits to state governments, many in the Jim Crow South. Local officials routinely denied Black applicants loans, steered them to segregated and underfunded schools, or simply buried their paperwork. The very law meant to reward service became another arena of discrimination, reinforcing barriers to wealth and education. The inequities extended to women as well. During the war, millions had filled factories, offices, and military support roles. They had welded steel-flown supply planes and managed complex logistics with competence and grit. But when peace arrived, society expected them to relinquish those jobs to returning men. Magazines and advertisements urged women back to the kitchen, extolling domestic bliss as the highest calling. Many complied out of necessity or cultural pressure, while others chafed at the sudden narrowing of opportunity. The seeds of the later feminist movement were planted in that moment of frustrated ambition. Even as America wrestled with these domestic adjustments, it faced a rapidly changing world. The devastation in Europe and Asia created both a humanitarian crisis and a vacuum of power. The United States alone possessed the economic strength to lead Reconstruction. In July 1944, even before the war ended, American officials convened allies in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a new global financial system. Out of that conference came the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, institutions meant to stabilize currencies and foster economic cooperation. By anchoring this system to the dollar and U.S. gold reserves, America quietly cemented its role as the fulcrum of world trade. The political implications were equally profound. President Roosevelt, though in failing health, envisioned a post-war order that could prevent future global conflict. He believed a strong international body, what would become the United Nations, was essential. In 1944, at Dumbarton Oaks outside Washington, representatives of the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and China laid the groundwork. A year later in San Francisco, the United Nations Charter was signed, with President Harry S. Truman, Roosevelt's successor, pressing Congress to ratify it. The United States had positioned itself not only as an economic engine, but as the architect of a new diplomatic framework. Meanwhile, the shadow of the Soviet Union loomed ever larger. The wartime alliance masked deep ideological rifts. As Moscow tightened its grip on Eastern Europe, American leaders recognized that the next great struggle would be political and ideological rather than purely military. The victory of 1945 had not ushered in a simple peace. It had opened the first chapter of the Cold War. Still, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, most Americans felt an exhilarating sense of possibility. Streets filled with ticker tape parades, couples reunited, and families expanded in what would soon be called the baby boom. The combination of technological supremacy, economic abundance, and a seemingly endless horizon of opportunity created a confidence so strong it seemed almost inevitable. Yet history is rarely simple. The United States now bore responsibilities that dwarfed anything in its past. To lead meant to decide to intervene, and sometimes to impose. The moral questions raised by the atomic bomb, the unequal benefits of the GI Bill, and the emerging rivalry with the Soviet Union hinted that the post-war era would demand not just power, but wisdom. The war had ended, but America's transformation was only beginning. A nation once hesitant to engage with the world now found itself the central actor on a global stage. Its choices would shape not just its own destiny, but that of an entire century. As the echoes of wartime victory faded, millions of American servicemen stepped off troop ships and trains into a country brimming with promise, yet fraught with uncertainty. These men and women soldiers, sailors, airmen, nurses had crossed oceans and risked their lives. Now they faced the equally daunting task of building new lives in a rapidly changing nation. What awaited them was one of the most ambitious social experiments in U.S. history, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, known to all simply as the GI Bill. The GI Bill was more than a gesture of gratitude. It was a carefully engineered pathway from war to prosperity. It offered returning veterans an array of benefits, low-interest home loans, guaranteed by the federal government, unemployment compensation, and perhaps most transformative funding for college or vocational education. For millions who had never dreamed of higher learning or home ownership, it was an open door to opportunity. The impact was immediate and staggering. By 1956, roughly 7.8 million veterans had attended universities or trade schools on GI Bill subsidies. Classrooms that once echoed with the voices of the privileged now swelled with men and women who had traded rifles for textbooks. Lecture halls filled with students who carried the discipline of the battlefield into their studies, reshaping American higher education from an elite enclave into a mass experience. This flood of educated citizens would fuel innovation, drive entrepreneurship, and strengthen the nation's democratic institutions for decades to come. Just as profound was the housing revolution. Between 1944 and 1952, the Veterans Administration guaranteed more than 2.4 million home loans. Builders seized the moment, pioneering new methods of rapid, cost-effective construction. None was more famous than William Levitt, whose Levittown developments transformed empty fields into sprawling suburbs almost overnight. Using assembly line techniques borrowed from wartime production, Levitt built thousands of nearly identical houses, each affordable to families living on a single modest income. These tidy rows of homes, complete with small lawns and white picket fences, became the physical embodiment of the American dream. Young couples flocked to the suburbs eager for space safety and the promise of upward mobility. Cars became essential, and with them came the daily ritual of commuting, the growth of highway systems, and the birth of a new car culture. Shopping centers followed, and soon the suburban lifestyle, detached houses, private yards, family cars defined the aspirations of a generation. Economically, the effect was electric. Construction boomed, creating jobs in everything from carpentry to furniture manufacturing. Demand for automobiles, appliances, and home goods surged, feeding a consumer economy that seemed to expand without limit. For the first time, a broad middle class enjoyed not just subsistence, but genuine comfort: refrigerators in every kitchen, televisions in living rooms, and backyard barbecues on summer evenings. But this prosperity was not evenly shared. The GI Bill's benefits, while theoretically universal, were administered locally. And in many states, particularly across the Jim Crow South, racism distorted their distribution. Black veterans who had fought bravely in Europe and the Pacific often encountered insurmountable barriers. Bankers refused loans. Colleges imposed quotas or outright denied admission. State officials delayed or diverted funds, leaving countless African American families unable to claim what they had earned in service to their country. These injustices had lasting consequences. While white veterans accumulated wealth through homeownership and college degrees, many black veterans were locked out, widening the racial wealth gap for generations. The same Levittown developments that welcomed thousands of white families explicitly barred black buyers through restrictive covenants. A new American landscape was being built, but it was segregated by design. Women, too, faced a harsh readjustment. During the war, millions had worked in factories and offices, proving their capabilities beyond question. Yet as men returned, societal pressure pushed women back into domestic roles. Magazines and advertisers glorified the ideal of the cheerful homemaker, urging women to find fulfillment as wives and mothers. Many who had tasted independence found themselves dismissed from well-paying jobs or shunted into part-time clerical work with little security. For women in uniform, the exclusion was even starker. They were denied GI Bill benefits outright. Despite these inequities, the GI Bill reshaped the nation in profound ways. It democratized higher education, helping create a workforce that would lead the world in science, engineering, and the arts. It spurred a housing boom that redefined the American landscape, shifting the population from urban centers to suburban communities connected by an ever-expanding web of highways. And it reinforced the idea that government could be an active partner in citizens' prosperity, a lesson millions would carry into the future. Culturally, the move to suburbia rewrote the rhythms of daily life. Children played on quiet cul-de-sacs while fathers commuted to city offices and mothers managed homes. Television became a shared national hearth, broadcasting the same shows and advertisements into living rooms from coast to coast, creating a more uniform American culture than ever before. Backyard cookouts, Little League games, and neighborhood associations fostered a sense of stability and community, an appealing contrast to the uncertainty of the Depression and the chaos of war. Yet beneath the tidy lawns and new appliances, tensions simmered. The very uniformity that many found comforting could feel stifling to others. Artists and writers began to question the conformity of suburban life, planting the seeds of a counterculture that would flourish in the 1960s. And the glaring racial exclusions of the GI Bill and suburban development laid the groundwork for the civil rights struggle soon to come. Politically, the GI Bill's success carried a powerful message. When government invests in its people, the returns can be transformative. The program's relatively low default rates and massive economic multiplier effect silenced many critics of federal spending. Veterans who had once distrusted big government now saw firsthand the benefits of collective action. This shift in attitude helped sustain support for other post-war initiatives, from highway construction to scientific research. The rise of suburbia also accelerated the nation's car culture. Families needed reliable vehicles to commute to work and shop in distant centers, fueling demand for automobiles, gasoline, and the vast infrastructure of roads and highways. In 1956, Congress passed the Federal Aid Highway Act, launching the construction of the interstate highway system, an ambitious network that would connect the country like never before, reshaping commerce, travel, and even patterns of leisure. Education, too, experienced a quiet revolution. The influx of veterans transformed colleges, expanding faculties, curricula, and campus facilities. Professors encountered students older and more disciplined than typical undergraduates, bringing maturity and a global perspective sharpened by war. This generation of educated veterans would become the engineers, teachers, scientists, and civic leaders who propelled America through the Cold War and into the space age. For many veterans, the GI Bill meant more than financial security. It meant dignity and recognition. The government's promise to support them signaled that their sacrifice mattered. Letters home from new college students often brimmed with pride, describing classrooms as exciting as any battlefield victory. Families who moved into freshly built homes spoke of a future their Depression-era parents could scarcely imagine. Still, the contradictions were undeniable. While white families built equity and college credentials, black families often remained renters or were confined to segregated neighborhoods with inferior schools. Women who had riveted planes found themselves again confined to kitchens. The American dream was expanding, but it was not yet universal. By the end of the 1940s, however, the overall transformation was unmistakable. The United States had not merely returned to normalcy after war, it had leapt into a new era of middle-class prosperity. The GI Bill served as the engine suburbia, its visible symbol. The soldier who once crouched in a foxhole now stood in a trim yard grilling hamburgers for children who would grow up in a nation more powerful, more confident, and more complex than ever before. This unprecedented social mobility set the stage for the next great chapter, an America ready to shape global institutions, project power overseas, and grapple with the moral consequences of its newfound dominance. The quiet streets of Levittown were only the beginning of a far larger story, one in which the United States would wield economic and political influence on a scale the world had never seen. The end of the Second World War brought jubilation and opportunity for millions of Americans. Yet for many Black veterans, the long-awaited homecoming was shadowed by a new and bitter struggle. They had fought bravely in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, wearing the same uniforms, bleeding on the same battlefields, and saluting the same flag as their white comrades. But when they returned to claim the benefits promised under the GI Bill, they found doors slammed shut by the very nation they had defended. One of the GI Bill's most damaging compromises was the decision to let states, not the federal government, administer key provisions. This seemingly small detail carried enormous weight. In much of the Jim Crow South, where segregation reigned and white supremacy was enforced both by law and by violence, local officials wielded that authority as a weapon. Bankers and loan officers operating under the guise of local discretion routinely denied Black veterans the home loans that were essential for building wealth. Colleges, especially state-run institutions, imposed quotas or rejected Black applicants outright, no matter their service record. Consider the story repeated across countless towns. A veteran decorated for valor abroad who returned home to be told that the nearest college accepting Black students was hundreds of miles away, and that the neighborhood he could afford was redlined as hazardous, making a mortgage impossible. These weren't isolated incidents, but systemic practices that ensured the GI Bill would deepen, not diminish America's racial divide. The economic consequences were profound and enduring. While white veterans purchased homes in the burgeoning suburbs, their equity compounding with every passing year, Black families were often forced into renting in neighborhoods starved of investment. Property ownership, one of the surest paths to generational wealth, remained out of reach for millions who had earned it in service to their country. The gap in home ownership between Black and white Americans widened dramatically in the 1940s and 1950s, creating a wealth disparity that persists to this day. Employment offered little refuge. Black veterans returned to job markets that often viewed them with suspicion or outright hostility. Skilled trades were dominated by unions that excluded African Americans or relegated them to the lowest paying positions. The factories that had boomed during wartime now favored white workers, while Black laborers were frequently offered only menial low-wage jobs with no chance of advancement. Even in the North, where legal segregation was less entrenched, discrimination was common and opportunities limited. The injustice was not only economic, but deeply personal. Many Black servicemen had believed that their uniforms and medals would command respect at home. Instead, they faced threats, intimidation, and violence. In the summer of 1946 alone, more than a dozen Black veterans were murdered in racially motivated attacks across the South, often for something as simple as refusing to bow to Jim Crow norms. Newspapers reported these atrocities, but prosecutions were rare and convictions rarer still. The message was unmistakable. Military service might have won the war, but it had not won equality. Yet this bitter reality also sowed the seeds of a movement. Black veterans, emboldened by their experiences abroad, became some of the most determined advocates for civil rights. They had fought fascism in Europe and Asia. They were unwilling to accept racial tyranny at home. Organizations like the NAACP saw surging membership, and legal challenges to segregation multiplied. In 1947, a group of Black veterans in Mississippi petitioned the federal government to investigate the denial of their GI Bill benefits, drawing national attention to the issue. Their fight helped lay the groundwork for the broader civil rights struggle of the 1950s and 1960s. Meanwhile, the federal government's reluctance to confront state-level discrimination allowed inequities to harden. Redlining by banks endorsed by federal housing policies effectively trapped many black families in segregated urban neighborhoods. These areas were often deprived of infrastructure, investment, quality schools, and job opportunities, creating cycles of poverty difficult to escape. While suburban lawns flourished and property values soared, inner-city neighborhoods crumbled under neglect. The impact on education was equally stark. Although the GI Bill technically provided tuition for any accredited institution, black veterans in the South faced a cruel arithmetic. Segregated colleges often lacked space resources and advanced programs. Many simply could not absorb the influx of students seeking an education. Those who sought to attend traditionally white universities were frequently denied admission or faced hostile environments that made academic success nearly impossible. It is important to understand that these barriers were not merely the byproducts of individual prejudice, but the result of deliberate policy choices. Local control over federal benefits allowed racism to flourish under the veneer of states' rights. The federal government, eager to avoid political conflict, turned a blind eye, ensuring that the GI Bill, one of the most generous social programs in American history, became a tool of exclusion as much as inclusion. While black veterans fought for basic fairness, another marginalized group faced its own post-war reckoning: America's women. During the war, millions of women had stepped into roles once reserved for men, running assembly lines, managing offices, even flying military aircraft in auxiliary capacities. Their labor had been indispensable, their competence undeniable. Yet when the war ended, the nation's gratitude came with an expiration date. Employers laid off female workers en masse to make room for returning servicemen. Women who had earned union wages were pushed into lower-paying clerical jobs or encouraged to leave the workforce altogether. Popular magazines and advertisements flooded the culture with images of the cheerful housewife, radiant in pearls and high heels, as she served dinner or vacuumed a spotless living room. The message was clear: a woman's duty was now to the home. Some women embraced this vision of domesticity, finding genuine satisfaction in raising families during the baby boom. But many others, having tasted independence and skilled work, found the sudden confinement stifling. Letters and diaries from the period reveal frustration, even quiet despair, as women navigated the gap between wartime empowerment and post-war expectations. Their discontent would later ignite the second wave of the feminist movement, but in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the prevailing winds pushed them firmly back toward the kitchen. Thus, while the post-war years are often remembered as a golden age of prosperity, the reality was far more complex. The GI Bill created a thriving middle class, but it also widened racial and gender disparities. White male veterans enjoyed unprecedented opportunities to buy homes, earn degrees, and accumulate wealth. Black veterans and women were told, in effect, to wait their turn or accept less. These inequities carried long-term consequences for the nation. The suburban developments that symbolized American success became, by design, overwhelmingly white. Schools in those communities enjoyed better funding and resources, while urban neighborhoods, often home to black families excluded from the suburbs, struggled with overcrowding and neglect. The economic boom thus reinforced a segregated society, entrenching advantages for some while denying them to others. Yet resistance was never far from the surface. Black veterans, many of whom had seen societies abroad less rigidly segregated, began to challenge injustice with new determination. Their demands for equal access to education, housing, and employment formed the early backbone of the modern civil rights movement. Women too quietly organized and shared their frustrations, planting the seeds for the activism that would erupt a generation later. The contradiction at the heart of post-war America was plain. A nation that had fought for freedom across the world was struggling to deliver it at home. The GI Bill, hailed as a triumph of social policy, revealed the limits of federal benevolence when local prejudice was allowed to rule. Prosperity was real, but it was not universal. The dream was bright, but for millions it remained deferred. This uneasy reality set the stage for the battles to come. As the 1950s unfolded, the United States would project power across the globe, rebuild former enemies, and confront a new ideological rival in the Soviet Union. But within its own borders, the struggle for true equality was only beginning. The promises of democracy made so boldly on distant battlefields would have to be fought for again in courtrooms and classrooms and on the streets of America itself. During the Second World War, American women stepped into roles few had imagined possible. With millions of men overseas, the country's factories, shipyards, and offices faced a labor shortage that could have crippled the war effort. Instead, women poured into the workforce, proving indispensable to victory and shattering old assumptions about what they could achieve. They became machinists, welders, engineers, and pilots in the Women Air Force Service Pilots WASP program. They learned to operate heavy machinery, manage supply chains, and design complex systems. The image of Rosie the Riveter, sleeves rolled and bicep flexed beneath a red polka dot bandana, captured the spirit of the moment, confident, capable, and utterly essential. By 1945, nearly 1 in 4 married women worked outside the home, a dramatic increase from pre-war numbers. This transformation was more than statistical, it was psychological. For many, a paycheck and professional responsibility brought a sense of independence unknown to earlier generations. Women discovered talents and ambitions that had been stifled by tradition. In bustling factories and buzzing offices, friendships formed across class lines, uniting women in the shared experience of urgent production. They built ships, assembled aircraft, coded intelligence, and even ferried planes from factory to front tasks once declared impossible for their gender. But when the war ended, the nation's attitude shifted almost overnight. As soldiers returned, society expected women to relinquish their jobs and resume the domestic roles they had temporarily left behind. Newspapers and magazines that once celebrated female workers now extolled the virtues of homemaking. Advertisers flooded the airwaves with cheerful images of mothers in gleaming kitchens, their ambitions focused on spotless floors and well-fed children. Employers followed suit. Women were laid off in huge numbers to make room for returning servicemen. Those who kept their jobs often faced demotions, pay cuts, or relegation to clerical work. Even skilled welders and engineers found their wartime experience dismissed as a patriotic interlude rather than a legitimate career. For many, the sudden loss of independence was a bitter blow. The cultural pressure to conform was relentless. Best-selling magazines like Ladies' Home Journal and Good Housekeeping promoted the ideal of the nuclear family, presenting domestic bliss as the pinnacle of female fulfillment. Television, an emerging force in American life, reinforced these images with sitcoms that showcased perfect wives and mothers presiding over immaculate homes. Popular psychology warned that career-minded women risked damaging their children or undermining their husband's masculinity. Yet, beneath this glossy surface, discontent simmered. Diaries, letters, and oral histories from the period reveal the quiet frustration of women who had experienced the pride of skilled labor and then were told their place was back in the kitchen. Many mourned the loss of income and purpose. Some sought part-time work or night classes, searching for ways to hold on to the autonomy they had briefly enjoyed. Their restlessness planted seeds that would eventually blossom into the women's rights movements of the 1960s and 1970s. The post-war economic boom only sharpened the contradictions. While suburban homes filled with modern appliances promised convenience and comfort, they also reinforced women's isolation. The very labor-saving devices that made housework easier sometimes left women feeling unneeded, their days stretched out in repetitive chores. Sociologists later noted a rise in what Betty Friedan famously called the problem that has no name, a sense of emptiness beneath the polished veneer of domestic success. Still, not all women retreated willingly. Millions remained in the workforce, often in lower-paying, traditionally female occupations such as teaching, nursing, and secretarial work. They formed the backbone of new service industries that grew alongside the consumer economy. But their wages lagged far behind those of men, and advancement opportunities were scarce. The notion that women's earnings were merely supplemental to a husband's salary kept many locked in economic dependency. African American women faced even steeper challenges. During the war, they had found new opportunities in defense industries and government offices, but in peacetime, many were pushed back into domestic service or low-wage jobs. Segregation and discrimination compounded their struggles, and the GI Bill's uneven implementation meant that Black families often lacked the resources to pursue higher education or suburban housing. For these women, the wartime glimpse of economic mobility faded quickly, though the determination it inspired remained. The tension between expectation and experience also played out in family life. The post-war baby boom, nearly 77 million births between 1946 and 1964, brought joy to many households, but it also reinforced the ideal of the full-time mother. Parenting experts and popular advice columns emphasized women's responsibility for children's emotional well-being, casting any deviation from domestic devotion as selfish or dangerous. Even women who relished motherhood sometimes chafed at the idea that their identities must be defined solely by it. Despite these pressures, the war had permanently altered perceptions of women's capabilities. Those who had riveted airplanes or decoded enemy messages knew they could master complex tasks and handle high-stakes responsibility. Their daughters grew up hearing stories of those achievements, quietly absorbing the lesson that a woman's place need not be limited to the home. This generational memory would prove powerful in the decades to come. In politics, too, the seeds of change were sprouting. Female veterans and former war workers began to organize for equal rights, joining unions, lobbying for fair employment, and challenging discriminatory practices. In 1946, the Women's Bureau of the Department of Labor reported that women were a permanent and growing part of the labor force, a statement that acknowledged reality even as culture tried to deny it. Grassroots organizations advocated for child care centers, equal pay, and access to higher education, laying early groundwork for legislative battles ahead. The story of women's wartime gains and post-war setbacks is thus not a simple arc of progress followed by retreat. It is a complex dance of empowerment and resistance, of advances claimed and then challenged. The factories and airfields of the 1940s proved what women could do when given the chance. The kitchens and cul-de-sacs of the 1950s revealed how fiercely society could fight to contain that potential. Together, these experiences created a well of quiet determination that future movements would draw upon. By the late 1940s, as America settled into its new role as a global superpower, the tension was palpable. The nation celebrated its prosperity and the ideal of the happy suburban family. But beneath the surface, women were already questioning the limits imposed on their lives. The very prosperity that confined them also provided the education communication networks and leisure time that would later fuel organized activism. In retrospect, the wartime mobilization of women stands as one of the great paradoxes of the 20th century. It showcased female competence on an unprecedented scale, then attempted to erase the memory of that competence when peace returned. But memories do not fade so easily. The women who had riveted, flown, and strategized carried their experiences like a hidden flame. Their daughters would fan that flame into a blaze that would challenge and eventually transform American society. Meanwhile, the nation's attention was turning outward once again. With domestic life seemingly stabilized, at least on the surface, American leaders looked beyond their borders, determined to shape a world that would never again descend into such catastrophic war. Economic planning and international diplomacy beckoned, and the United States was ready to wield its new power on the global stage. The next chapter of America's post-war story would unfold not in factories or suburban kitchens, but in grand hotels and conference halls, where economic architects and political visionaries gathered to design a framework for global cooperation and enduring peace. While millions of Americans were still savoring peacetime comforts, a different kind of battle was underway in the summer of 1944, a battle to shape the world's financial future. High in the wooded hills of New Hampshire, the quiet resort town of Bretton Woods became the unlikely stage for an economic summit unlike any in history. As Allied soldiers fought across Europe and the Pacific, 730 delegates from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel to design a system that could prevent the kind of economic chaos that had fueled the Great Depression and ultimately global war. The stakes were enormous. Memories of the interwar years remained raw: the stock market crash of 1929, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that throttled international trade, the currency devaluations that pitted nation against nation in a race to the bottom. The architects of Bretton Woods believed that economic instability had been a seedbed for fascism and conflict. They aimed to replace that instability with cooperation, and they knew the United States, now the world's largest creditor and industrial powerhouse, would have to lead. Two men in particular embodied the conference's grand ambitions. Britain's John Maynard Keynes, the celebrated economist whose ideas about government spending had influenced the New Deal, and Harry Dexter White, a U.S. Treasury official determined to cement American financial dominance. Keynes, representing a Britain weakened by war and debt, sought a balanced system that would not crush debtor nations. White, backed by the sheer might of the U.S. economy, insisted on a framework that placed the dollar at its center. For 3 intense weeks, delegates debated exchange rates, lending mechanisms, and the architecture of a new financial order. The atmosphere was a curious blend of scholarly rigor and wartime urgency. Translators worked late into the night. Smoke-filled lounges buzzed with argument. Typewriters clattered as drafts of proposals flew back and forth. Though the world outside remained at war, these delegates were already fighting to win the peace. The outcome was nothing short of revolutionary. From Bretton Woods emerged 2 institutions destined to shape the next century: the International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, soon known as the World Bank. The IMF would provide short-term financial assistance to countries struggling with balance of payments issues, stabilizing exchange rates, and discouraging competitive devaluations. The World Bank would offer long-term loans to rebuild war-torn nations and fund development projects across the globe. Central to the agreement was the decision to peg currencies to the US dollar itself, convertible to gold, at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce. This effectively placed the dollar at the heart of international trade, elevating it to the status of global reserve currency. For the United States, it was a triumph of economic diplomacy. American financial stability became the anchor for a system designed to foster growth and prevent the beggar-thy-neighbor policies that had helped ignite 2 world wars. The significance of Bretton Woods extended far beyond economics. It represented a philosophical shift from isolationism to global stewardship. Just a generation earlier, the United States had recoiled from the League of Nations and retreated into domestic concerns. Now it was writing the rules of a new world order. By committing to international institutions, America signaled that it intended not merely to participate in global affairs, but to guide them. For war-weary nations, the promise of a stable economic framework offered hope amid devastation. In Europe, where factories lay in ruins and currencies teetered on collapse, the prospect of access to World Bank loans was a lifeline. In Asia and Latin America, leaders saw in the IMF a potential buffer against the violent market swings that had impoverished millions in the 1930s. While skeptics worried about ceding sovereignty, the urgency of reconstruction and the sheer gravitational pull of the American economy left little doubt that participation was essential. Back in the United States, news of the Bretton Woods agreements reached a public eager for signs that the sacrifices of war would yield a lasting peace. Newspapers hailed the conference as a milestone of cooperation. President Roosevelt, though gravely ill, understood the political importance of the achievement. He framed the new institutions as safeguards against the economic despair that had once given rise to dictators. The economic health of every country is a proper matter of concern to all its neighbors, he declared, capturing the new ethos of interdependence. Yet the system was not without critics or complexities. Some feared that making the dollar the linchpin of global finance gave the United States too much power and too much responsibility. Others worried that the IMF might impose harsh conditions on borrowing nations, sacrificing social needs for financial stability. Keynes himself, though largely satisfied, warned that without vigilance, the arrangement could become a tool of domination rather than cooperation. Still, the immediate impact was profound. As the war drew to a close, the IMF and World Bank began operations providing loans and guidance to nations struggling to rebuild. The dollar-based system helped stabilize exchange rates, encouraging the explosion of international trade that fueled the post-war economic boom. For a time, Bretton Woods delivered precisely what its architects intended: growth without the chaos of competitive devaluation, cooperation without the paralysis of isolationism. The conference also set a precedent for American leadership that extended beyond economics. By hosting and largely directing the negotiations, the United States demonstrated that it could convene nations, forge consensus, and institutionalize global cooperation. This confidence would carry into the political realm, where Roosevelt and his successor, Harry Truman, envisioned an even more ambitious project: a permanent international body dedicated to peace and security. Indeed, Bretton Woods was the prelude to the creation of the United Nations. Many of the same diplomats who debated currency parities in New Hampshire would soon gather again, this time to draft a charter for an organization meant to prevent war itself. The logic was clear: economic stability and political peace were inseparable. Without the first, the second would always be fragile. For ordinary Americans, the changes Bretton Woods set in motion were less visible but deeply consequential. The stability of the dollar underpinned decades of rising prosperity. Consumers buying imported goods, businesses expanding overseas, travelers exchanging currency, all benefited from a system that reduced the risks of sudden economic shocks. Even those who never heard of the IMF felt its influence every time they purchased a product priced in a stable global market. Yet the new order also bound the United States to a role of perpetual engagement. As guardian of the dollar and principal shareholder in the IMF, and World Bank, America could no longer retreat behind its oceans. Economic crises abroad became matters of national interest. The prosperity of allies and even distant nations was now tied to American policy and oversight. It was a commitment that would shape U.S. foreign relations for the rest of the century. Bretton Woods thus marked a turning point as momentous in its own way as any battlefield victory. It signaled the arrival of an America willing to lead not only with armies, but with ideas, institutions, and economic muscle. The conference's agreements would guide international finance for a generation until the system unraveled in the 1970s, but its legacy of cooperation endures. As delegates packed their bags and left the tranquil mountains of New Hampshire, they could not know every challenge that lay ahead. The rebuilding of Europe, the onset of the Cold War, the inevitable tensions between national interests and global governance. But they understood that they had laid the foundation for a new era. The world, battered by depression and war, had taken a first bold step towards stability. And the United States, once wary of entanglements, now stood firmly at the center of the global stage. Even as the Bretton Woods delegates packed away their ledgers and celebrated their new economic framework, another gathering of world leaders was already taking shape. One aimed not merely at financial stability, but at safeguarding global peace itself. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had championed the idea of a new international body long before Pearl Harbor, believed that economic agreements would mean little unless nations could prevent the political catastrophes that sparked war. His vision was audacious: a permanent organization where the world's major powers would cooperate to avert future conflicts. The seeds of this plan were sown during the dark early days of World War II. Even as bombs rained on London and armies clashed across continents, Roosevelt spoke privately of a United Nations, a coalition that would endure beyond the defeat of the Axis powers. He imagined a forum that would combine the moral authority of a global assembly with the decisive power of the great military victors. To him, lasting peace required more than treaties. It required an institution capable of collective action when diplomacy failed. By 1944, As Allied victory appeared increasingly certain, Roosevelt moved to turn his idea into reality. That August, representatives of the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and the Republic of China convened at Dumbarton Oaks, a stately mansion tucked into the leafy avenues of Washington, D.C. For 2 months, they debated the structure of what would become the United Nations. The talks were intense, sometimes fractious, as delegates weighed how to balance universal membership with the hard truth that only a handful of nations possess the military power to enforce peace. The key breakthrough was the concept of a Security Council, an executive body with the authority to act swiftly in crises backed by the force of international law, and, if necessary, armed intervention. The United States insisted that the permanent members, the wartime allies, each hold veto power, reasoning that no plan could succeed without the consent of the world's strongest nations. It was a pragmatic compromise, better to give the great powers a formal seat and a veto than to risk their defiance outside the system. Even as these discussions advanced, Roosevelt's health was failing. The strain of guiding the nation through depression and war had taken its toll. Yet he remained steadfast convinced that the creation of the United Nations would be the crowning achievement of his presidency. The structure of world peace cannot be the work of one man or one party or one nation. He told Congress it must be a peace which rests on the cooperative effort of the whole world. He would not live to see the final charter signed, but his determination set the course. After Roosevelt's death in April 1945, the responsibility fell to Harry S. Truman. Though new to the presidency, Truman recognized the importance of the project and threw his full support behind it. In June of that year, just weeks after the defeat of Nazi Germany, delegates from 50 nations assembled in San Francisco to draft the United Nations Charter. The city buzzed with optimism and urgency. Flags of every color fluttered in the ocean breeze as diplomats debated late into the night, refining language that would shape the future. The resulting document was both sweeping and specific. It affirmed faith in fundamental human rights, the dignity and worth of every person, and the equal rights of nations, large and small. It pledged to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. The charter established a General Assembly where all member states would have a voice, a Security Council empowered to maintain peace, an International Court of Justice to settle disputes, and specialized agencies to tackle issues from health to education. On October 24, 1945, the United Nations officially came into being when the required number of nations ratified the charter. President Truman, carrying forward Roosevelt's legacy personally, signed the document on behalf of the United States and urged swift congressional approval. The charter is dedicated to the achievement and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all people everywhere. He declared framing U.S. participation as a moral imperative as well as a strategic one. For Americans, the decision to join the United Nations marked a profound departure from the past. After World War I, the Senate had famously refused to ratify U.S. membership in the League of Nations, fearing entanglement in foreign quarrels. The isolationist mood of the 1920s had left the world without a strong mechanism to prevent aggression. Now chastened by the devastation of a second global war and confident in their newfound power, Americans embraced an international role with unprecedented enthusiasm. Polls showed broad public support, and the Senate ratified the charter by a vote of 89-2. The creation of the United Nations signaled that the United States had accepted a permanent responsibility in world affairs. American soldiers might come home, but American influence would remain abroad. The country's leaders understood that peace was no longer something the nation could secure in splendid isolation. It required cooperation, vigilance, and sometimes intervention. The oceans that once seemed to protect the continent had become in the age of long-range bombers and atomic weapons mere moats around a global citadel. The early work of the UN reflected both idealism and hard reality. The organization established agencies to address refugees' food shortages and the rebuilding of war-ravaged economies. It mediated disputes in the Middle East, supervised elections in war-torn regions, and created the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization UNESCO to promote knowledge and cultural exchange. The very existence of a neutral forum where nations could air grievances and negotiate solutions was itself a remarkable achievement in the wake of such widespread destruction. Yet the UN also revealed the complexities of the New World Order. The same Security Council veto that made great power participation possible could also paralyze action when those powers disagreed. Almost immediately, tensions between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies began to surface, foreshadowing the geopolitical standoff that would define the Cold War. Still, the institution endured, offering a stage where diplomacy could sometimes diffuse crises before they ignited into war. For the United States, leadership in the UN carried both prestige and responsibility. American diplomats, guided by a blend of idealism and pragmatism, sought to use the organization to promote democratic values while containing the spread of totalitarianism. The Marshall Plan, launched soon after, would complement these efforts by providing massive economic aid to rebuild Europe, reinforcing the notion that political stability and economic recovery were inseparable. Ordinary Americans might not have followed every debate in San Francisco or New York, but they felt the effects of the United Nations in subtle ways. Relief programs helped stabilize global food supplies, preventing famines that could have destabilized regions and triggered new conflicts. International health initiatives contributed to the containment of epidemics. Cultural and scientific exchanges brought a sense of connection to a wider world, broadening horizons even in small Midwestern towns. The symbolism of the United Nations was powerful. After years of bloodshed, the sight of diplomats from dozens of nations seated together beneath a single emblem offered a glimmer of hope that humanity could rise above its divisions. For a generation scarred by war, the blue and white UN flag represented the possibility of dialogue, where once there had only been gunfire. Still, challenges remained immense. The Soviet Union quickly turned Eastern Europe into a sphere of influence, prompting the West to question whether cooperation with Moscow could ever be genuine. In Asia, civil wars and decolonization movements threatened instability. The very need for a strong United Nations underscored the fragility of the peace it was meant to preserve. Yet for all its flaws and limitations, the creation of the UN marked a turning point. It institutionalized the idea that the great powers bore a collective responsibility for world security. It offered smaller nations a voice, however modest, in global affairs. And it demonstrated that the United States, once reluctant to engage with the world, was now committed to shaping it. As 1945 drew to a close, the United States stood at the center of a new international order, with the dollar anchoring the global economy and the United Nations offering a forum for diplomacy. America had embraced a dual-role economic engine and political leader. The country that had once hesitated to join the League of Nations now shouldered the mantle of global stewardship, convinced that its own prosperity and security were inseparable from the stability of the wider world. The next challenge would test both the United Nations and American resolve, the rising tension with the Soviet Union, whose expanding influence in Eastern Europe threatened to fracture the fragile post-war consensus. The Cold War loomed, and the institutions just created would soon be called upon to navigate a world once again divided by ideology and power. Barely had the ink dried on the United Nations Charter when fault lines began to open between the wartime allies. The uneasy partnership that had defeated Hitler was giving way to suspicion and rivalry. In the ashes of Europe, two very different visions of the post-war world collided. The United States championed liberal democracy and free market capitalism, while the Soviet Union sought to spread communist ideology and tighten its grip on Eastern Europe. Out of this clash emerged a geopolitical struggle that would dominate the second half of the 20th century, the Cold War. The earliest signs of tension were unmistakable. In 1946, Winston Churchill, no longer Britain's prime minister but still a towering statesman, traveled to Fulton, Missouri and delivered his famous Iron Curtain speech. He warned that Soviet influence had descended across the continent from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, creating a line of division between free and oppressed societies. President Harry Truman, seated beside Churchill, did not publicly endorse every word, but the message resonated. Americans increasingly viewed the Soviet Union not as a wartime ally, but as a potential adversary. Events in Eastern Europe confirmed these fears. Moscow installed pro-Soviet governments in Poland, Hungary, Romania, and elsewhere, transforming liberated nations into satellite states. Communist parties backed by the Red Army suppressed opposition and reshaped economies along socialist lines. To U.S. leaders, this was not mere post-war jockeying. It was an aggressive campaign to expand authoritarian rule. The Truman administration responded with a policy that came to define the era containment. Rather than confront the Soviet Union directly, an escalation that could trigger another world war, the United States aimed to prevent further expansion of communism. Diplomat George F. Kennan, writing under the pseudonym X in Foreign Affairs, articulated the strategy: a patient but firm resistance to Soviet influence wherever it threatened to spread. The goal was not immediate confrontation, but long-term pressure, based on the belief that the Soviet system would eventually collapse under its own contradictions. Containment took many forms, beginning with the Marshall Plan in 1947. Named for Secretary of State George C. Marshall, the plan provided more than $13 billion in economic aid to help Western European nations rebuild their shattered economies. The logic was simple, and shrewd, prosperous, stable democracies were less likely to fall prey to communist movements. Factories were repaired, farms revitalized, and trade networks restored. The plan was both humanitarian and strategic, and it succeeded beyond expectations, spurring remarkable economic recovery across Europe. At the same time, the United States demonstrated a new willingness to project power far from its shores. When the Soviet Union blockaded West Berlin in 1948, cutting off road and rail access in an attempt to force the Allies out of the city, the United States and its partners launched the Berlin Airlift. For nearly a year, American and British planes delivered food, coal, and supplies to the beleaguered city, an extraordinary feat of logistics that defied Soviet pressure without firing a shot. The airlift not only sustained West Berlin, but showcased America's resolve to defend freedom in the heart of Europe. These efforts culminated in the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization (NATO) in 1949. For the first time in its history, the United States entered a formal peacetime military alliance, pledging that an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. NATO signaled a definitive break with America's isolationist past. The United States was now the linchpin of Western security, committed to defending Europe against Soviet aggression. The Cold War soon extended beyond Europe. In Asia, the end of the war had left a power vacuum that both the United States and the Soviet Union sought to influence. China, after years of civil conflict, fell to communist forces led by Mao Zedong in 1949, sending shockwaves through Washington. The Korean Peninsula, divided at the 38th parallel after Japan's surrender, became the first major battlefield of the new ideological struggle. When North Korean forces invaded the South in 1950, the United States, under the banner of the United Nations, led a multinational coalition to repel the attack. The Korean War was brutal and inconclusive, but it underscored America's willingness to fight literally to contain communism. While troops engaged in open conflict, covert operations became another weapon in the American arsenal. The Central Intelligence Agency, established in 1947, orchestrated secret missions to influence election support, friendly regimes, and undermine perceived communist sympathizers. In Italy and France, the CIA funneled money to political parties resisting communist influence. In Iran 1953 and Guatemala 1954, it helped engineer coups that replaced elected governments with leaders more aligned with U.S. interests. These actions, often hidden from public view, reflected a belief that the stakes of the Cold War justified extraordinary measures. Domestically, the struggle with the Soviet Union fueled a climate of suspicion and fear. Revelations that Soviet agents had infiltrated U.S. government agencies heightened anxiety. The the arrest and execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg for passing atomic secrets to the Soviets, and the rise of Senator Joseph McCarthy's aggressive investigations fed a culture of paranoia. McCarthyism became synonymous with reckless accusations and loyalty tests, reminding Americans that the battle against communism was as much psychological as military. Despite these tensions, the policy of containment scored significant early successes. Western Europe stabilized and prospered under the Marshall Plan. NATO deterred Soviet aggression. The Berlin airlift demonstrated ingenuity and resolve. Even the stalemate in Korea, while costly, prevented the spread of communism to the entire peninsula. America's combination of economic aid, military alliances, and covert action created a framework that would guide U.S. foreign policy for decades. Yet the costs were real. Military spending soared, creating what President Dwight Eisenhower later warned was a military-industrial complex with its own momentum and influence. Proxy wars and covert interventions sometimes propped up authoritarian regimes, undermining America's professed commitment to democracy. And the constant readiness for conflict imposed a psychological burden as families built bomb shelters and school children practiced duck and cover drills in anticipation of nuclear attack. Still, for many Americans, the post-war years were marked by a sense of purpose and confidence. The United States was no longer merely reacting to world events, it was shaping them. Through a combination of diplomacy, economic power, and military might, it had assumed a leadership role that seemed both inevitable and necessary. The lesson of the 1930s that isolation could invite catastrophe had been learned all too well. Containment also spurred remarkable technological advances. The competition with the Soviet Union accelerated developments in aerospace computing and nuclear energy. The same research that produced intercontinental ballistic missiles paved the way for satellites and the early steps toward space exploration. The Cold War, while fraught with danger, became a crucible of innovation. By the early 1950s, the outlines of the New World Order were clear. The United States led a network of alliances spanning Europe and Asia. Its currency anchored the global economy. Its military, though demobilized from wartime peaks, remained unmatched. The Soviet Union, equally determined and armed with its own atomic weapons, stood as the primary rival. The world was divided into two camps, each convinced of the righteousness of its cause. For ordinary Americans, this period was a study in contrasts. At home, prosperity surged. Suburban developments expanded, consumer goods proliferated, and the baby boom reshaped society. Abroad, the shadow of nuclear war loomed, and soldiers fought and died in distant lands to defend principles that many citizens only vaguely understood. The Cold War was everywhere and nowhere, felt in policy debates and foreign headlines, but also in the quiet dread that the next conflict could be the last. Through it all, the central tenet of U.S. policy remained containment, a steady, patient effort to check Soviet power without triggering global annihilation. It required constant vigilance, flexible strategy, and at times morally ambiguous choices. But for American leaders and much of the public, the alternative, a world dominated by totalitarian communism, was unthinkable. By mid-century, the United States had fully embraced its role as a global superpower. No longer the hesitant nation of the interwar years, it now maintained a vast network of military bases, a robust alliance system, and an economy that influenced every corner of the globe. The Cold War was far from over, but the framework for American leadership, economic, political, and military was firmly in place. And the next chapter would take that leadership across the Pacific, where rebuilding a former enemy into an ally became both a strategic necessity and a test of America's ability to shape the post-war world. As Europe struggled to recover and America tightened its alliances across the Atlantic, attention shifted to the Pacific, specifically to a war-ravaged Japan. Once the rising sun of imperial ambition, Japan now lay in ruins. Cities such as Tokyo and Osaka had been reduced to smoking rubble by relentless firebombing. Hiroshima and Nagasaki bore the unprecedented scars of atomic destruction. Factories stood silent, railways twisted, and millions faced hunger. Yet for the United States, Japan was not merely a defeated enemy to be punished. It was the key to shaping post-war Asia and containing the spread of communism. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, American forces moved quickly to occupy the country. General Douglas MacArthur became supreme commander for the Allied powers. But in reality, the occupation was overwhelmingly American in leadership and vision. MacArthur's mandate was twofold: to demilitarize Japan so that it could never again threaten global peace, and to build a stable democratic ally in a region where Soviet influence was already on the march. The early reforms were sweeping and symbolic. The Japanese military was dismantled, weapons were confiscated, and war industries dismantled. The emperor, once revered as a living deity, was compelled to renounce his divine status. A new constitution, drafted largely by American officials but presented as a Japanese document, enshrined democratic principles, universal suffrage, a parliamentary system, and a dramatic Article 9 clause renouncing war as a sovereign right. For the first time, women gained the right to vote, signaling a profound social shift. Economic restructuring followed. Large industrial conglomerates, the zaibatsu, which had fueled Japan's militarism, were targeted for dissolution. Land reform broke up vast estates, redistributing farmland to millions of tenant farmers and weakening the old aristocracy. These policies aimed to undercut the social and economic hierarchies that had supported the militarist state, fostering instead a broad middle class that could anchor a democratic society. Yet the American presence was not solely punitive, it was also pragmatic. The outbreak of the Cold War soon made Japan's recovery a strategic priority. A devastated, chaotic Japan might invite communist revolution or Soviet influence. To counter that risk, the United States began to shift from strict demilitarization toward economic revitalization. Aid flowed in the form of food machinery and technical assistance. American advisors encouraged the rebuilding of industry, laying the groundwork for Japan's eventual economic miracle. The formal peace came with the Treaty of San Francisco, signed on September 8, 1951. The treaty officially ended the state of war between Japan and most allied nations and restored Japan's sovereignty. Yet it also cemented a long-term American presence. The United States retained extensive military bases, ensuring a strategic foothold in the Pacific and a counterweight to Communist China and the Soviet Far East. Even today, American forces remain stationed in Okinawa and other parts of Japan, a living legacy of these post-war arrangements. This rebuilding effort extended beyond economics and politics. It sought to reshape Japanese society. American occupation authorities encouraged labor unions, educational reforms, and a free press. Censorship of the old militaristic propaganda was enforced, while democratic ideals were promoted through schools and media. Over time, many Japanese citizens embraced these changes, blending them with their own cultural traditions to create a unique post-war identity. The transformation was remarkable. Within 2 decades, Japan would rise from devastation to become one of the world's leading economies, exporting cars, electronics, and culture across the globe. But in the late 1940s and early 1950s, such a future was far from certain. Hunger and homelessness were widespread. Inflation soared. American aid and careful policy provided the stability necessary for recovery. But the path was neither easy nor inevitable. Elsewhere in Asia, the United States pursued a broader strategy of containment. The Chinese Civil War ended in 1949 with Mao Zedong's communist forces victorious, creating a powerful new rival aligned with the Soviet Union. The Korean War, beginning in 1950, underscored the stakes: a hot conflict in which American soldiers fought and died to prevent the entire peninsula from falling under communist control. Southeast Asia simmered with anti-colonial movements and ideological clashes that would eventually draw the U.S. deeper into Vietnam. In this context, a stable, democratic, and pro-Western Japan was invaluable. It served as a bulwark against communist expansion, a base for U.S. forces, and a model of successful reconstruction. American policymakers recognized that winning the peace in Asia required more than military might. It demanded economic partnership and the patient cultivation of allies. The occupation also highlighted America's evolving role as a global power willing to shape other nations' destinies. The same country that once hesitated to intervene abroad now oversaw the political and economic restructuring of an entire nation. While many Japanese welcomed reforms, others resented the loss of sovereignty and the heavy American hand in their affairs. Protests occasionally flared, and debates about the U.S. military presence continue in Japan to this day. Nevertheless, the post-war partnership between the United States and Japan became one of the most consequential alliances of the modern era. From the ashes of war emerged not only a reformed nation, but a cornerstone of America's Pacific strategy. The lessons learned about Reconstruction economic assistance and the delicate balance between occupation and autonomy would inform U.S. policies in Europe, Korea, and beyond. By the early 1950s, the outlines of America's global position were unmistakable. Across the Atlantic, NATO anchored Western Europe. Across the Pacific, Japan stood transformed from adversary to ally, hosting American bases and embracing democratic governance. The United States had become a truly global superpower capable of shaping political systems, rebuilding economies, and projecting force on a scale unprecedented in history. But America's reach extended even further, and often more quietly. Beyond the visible diplomacy and open treaties, a shadow war was taking shape. One waged not with armies, but with covert operations and clandestine influence. The next chapter of the post-war story would unfold in secrecy as the newly created CIA carried out missions designed to tip the global balance of power without a formal declaration of war. As the United States fortified alliances in Europe and rebuilt Japan into a Pacific partner, another less visible front opened in the struggle for global influence. It was a contest fought not with open armies, but with secrets, deception, and deniable actions. The Central Intelligence Agency, created in 1947, became the spear point of this hidden war, carrying out covert operations to shape events far beyond America's borders. The rationale was straightforward: in the nuclear age, direct confrontation with the Soviet Union risked annihilation. Yet Washington believed it could not allow communist movements to spread unchecked. The CIA offered a way to act forcefully while avoiding the spectacle and potential escalation of open military engagement. In its first decades, the agency developed a toolkit of clandestine tactics, funding friendly political parties, planting propaganda, training guerrillas, and orchestrating coups. One of the earliest and most consequential operations unfolded in Iran in 1953. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh had moved to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian oil company, threatening British interests and alarming U.S. leaders who feared a leftward drift. Working with British intelligence, the CIA launched Operation Ajax. Through a combination of bribery, propaganda, and the careful mobilization of street protests, the agency helped topple Mossadegh and reinstall the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi as a pro-Western monarch. The coup secured Western oil access, but sowed seeds of resentment that would erupt decades later in the Iranian Revolution. A year later, a similar drama played out in Guatemala. President Jacobo Arbenz had introduced land reforms that threatened the holdings of the US-based United Fruit Company and seemed to American officials dangerously sympathetic to communism. In Operation PB a success, the CIA armed and supported a rebel force, broadcast psychological warfare via radio, and spread disinformation to destabilize the government. Arbenz resigned, and a military regime friendly to US interests took power. For the agency, it was another success, but for Guatemalans, it ushered in years of instability and repression. These operations exemplified a pattern repeated across the globe. From Southeast Asia to Latin America, the CIA worked to influence elections, support anti-communist insurgencies, and undermine left-leaning governments. In the Philippines, it backed Ramon Magsaysay's rise to the presidency as a bulwark against communist guerrillas. In Indonesia, it covertly supported rebels against President Sukarno. In Africa, it funneled resources to leaders deemed pro-Western regardless of their democratic credentials. The guiding principle was containment: stop the spread of communism by any means short of open war. Covert action also extended to Europe, where the CIA secretly financed non-communist labor unions, newspapers, and cultural organizations. The agency quietly supported the publication of anti-Soviet literature, funded influential magazines, and even underwrote abstract art exhibitions to showcase Western creative freedom. In Italy and France, it funneled money to centrist parties to counter strong communist movements shaping political landscapes without the public ever knowing. The Berlin Airlift and Marshall Plan had showcased America's resolve in daylight. The CIA's operations were the midnight counterpart waging psychological and political warfare in the shadows. Successes were often invisible failures easily denied. When uprisings in Eastern Europe like the 1956 Hungarian Revolution were crushed by Soviet tanks, the CIA could offer only limited support, revealing the limits of covert power against direct military force. Domestically, these secret wars fueled a mystique around the agency. Popular culture began to romanticize espionage even as real operations carried moral ambiguities. Presidents of both parties relied on the CIA appreciating its ability to act quickly and discreetly. Yet the very secrecy that made the agency effective also insulated it from oversight, allowing questionable tactics, bribery, manipulation of foreign media, and in some cases, plots to assassinate foreign leaders. Critics warned that America risked undermining its own ideals. How could a nation that proclaimed support for democracy justify overthrowing elected governments? Supporters countered that the stakes of the Cold War required tough choices. To them, covert action was a necessary middle ground between appeasement and nuclear confrontation. Beyond political coups, the CIA also became a key player in technological intelligence. It developed sophisticated surveillance programs, recruited high-level defectors, and launched daring missions to gather information behind the Iron Curtain. U-2 spy planes soared above Soviet territory, photographing missile sites and military installations. Submarines crept through Arctic waters to tap undersea cables. These efforts provided critical insights into Soviet capabilities and intentions shaping U.S. strategy throughout the Cold War. The agency's reach extended to Asia as well. In Korea, it provided intelligence and supported guerrilla operations during the war. In Vietnam, it began early advisory roles that would later expand into full-scale involvement. In Tibet, agents trained resistance fighters to harass Chinese forces after the 1950 invasion. Each operation reflected a belief that small targeted actions could tip the balance in the global contest with communism. Yet even victories carried long shadows. The 1953 Iranian coup, initially hailed in Washington, fostered deep anti-American sentiment that erupted in the 1979 hostage crisis. In Latin America, support for authoritarian regimes often fueled cycles of violence and human rights abuses. What seemed like tactical successes sometimes produced strategic headaches, illustrating the unintended consequences of covert power. Still, by the late 1950s, the CIA had become an indispensable instrument of U.S. policy. Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy would rely heavily on its operations, from influencing elections to planning the ill-fated Bay of Pigs invasion. The agency's clandestine victories and missteps alike became woven into the fabric of the Cold War, a conflict waged as much in shadows as in open confrontation. For the American public, the full extent of these activities remained largely hidden. Newspapers occasionally hinted at mysterious interventions, but official denials and the cloak of national security kept most details secret for decades. To the world, however, the consequences were tangible. Governments toppled, alliances shifted, and the balance of power subtly but unmistakably altered. By the dawn of the 1960s, the United States possessed not only the world's largest economy and most powerful military, but also a covert apparatus capable of influencing events on nearly every continent. It was an empire of influence as much as territory sustained by dollars alliances and the quiet work of operatives whose names would never appear in headlines. This shadow empire underscored a larger truth about America's post-war rise. Power was no longer measured solely in battleships or factories. It resided as well in the ability to shape perception, steer politics, and act unseen. The CIA's covert campaigns, whether lauded as bold or condemned as reckless, became a defining feature of the American superpower, a nation willing to wield every tool overt or hidden to defend its vision of the free world. By the dawn of the 1960s, the United States stood astride the globe in a way no nation ever had. Its territory stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from Alaska to Hawaii, and its military footprint reached still farther across Europe, the Middle East, and deep into Asia. The American flag fluttered over bases in Berlin and Tokyo, over airfields in Okinawa and Guam, over listening posts in the Arctic and outposts in the Caribbean. The country that had once prided itself on avoiding foreign entanglements now maintained a lattice of alliances, trade routes, and military installations that encircled the planet. This reach was not merely geographic. Economically, the United States accounted for nearly half of global industrial production. The dollar, anchored by the Bretton Woods Agreement, served as the world's reserve currency, facilitating trade from Buenos Aires to Bangkok. American factories exported cars, airplanes, and electronics on a scale that dwarfed competitors. Its corporations General Motors, IBM, Coca-Cola became global icons, their logos as recognizable in Paris or Manila as in Detroit. American movies, music, and consumer goods carried cultural influence that rivaled the military's hard power. Military supremacy underpinned this dominance. Although millions of soldiers had returned to civilian life after World War II, the United States never fully demobilized. Its Navy patrolled every ocean. Its Air Force maintained fleets of long-range bombers capable of delivering nuclear payloads. Its Army kept garrisons in Europe, Asia, and beyond. The development of intercontinental ballistic missiles and a growing nuclear arsenal meant that American power could reach any point on the planet within hours. Allies relied on U.S. protection while adversaries measured their every move against Washington's potential response. Yet America's ascendance was more than a matter of weapons and wealth. It was a system of influence that shaped the internal affairs of other nations, often without a single shot fired. Through the Marshall Plan, the United States helped rebuild Western Europe, binding it into a network of economic and political partnerships that would evolve into the European Union. Through the CIA's covert operations, Washington installed or protected regimes aligned with its interests in Iran, Guatemala, South Korea, South Vietnam, and countless other places. Elections were swayed, coups, engineered rebellions, encouraged or suppressed. These efforts were justified as necessary to contain communism, but they also served to preserve American primacy. To many observers, this was empire in all but name. Unlike the colonial empires of Britain or France, the United States rarely ruled territories outright. Instead, it exercised what some scholars called informal empire or hegemony, a blend of economic leverage, military presence, and cultural sway that allowed Washington to guide the decisions of foreign governments while maintaining the appearance of their sovereignty. American officials rejected the imperial label, preferring to speak of leadership and partnership. But from Manila to Berlin, from Tehran to Havana, the effect was unmistakable. U.S. preferences shaped destinies. This new kind of empire came with contradictions. At home, Americans celebrated freedom and self-determination, yet their government often supported authoritarian leaders abroad if they opposed communism. Democratically elected governments were sometimes undermined when they pursued policies deemed unfriendly to U.S. interests. These inconsistencies fueled resentment and, at times, violent backlash. In places like Iran, Guatemala, and later Vietnam, the tension between American ideals and American actions would ignite crises that outlasted the Cold War itself. Still, the appeal of the American model was undeniable. War-torn nations looked to the United States for capital technology and know-how. Students from across the world flocked to American universities. Jazz Hollywood films and blue jeans became symbols of modernity and aspiration. The promise of personal liberty and economic opportunity drew immigrants and inspired reformers even in countries wary of Washington's power. The very culture of consumer abundance, suburban homes, cars, and televisions projected an image of progress that communist regimes struggled to match. Domestically, this global posture reshaped American life. Defense spending fueled scientific research and technological innovation, leading to breakthroughs in aerospace, computing, and medicine. The interstate highway system, initially justified in part for national defense, knit the country together and stimulated commerce. Prosperity seemed to validate the nation's expansive role abroad. Yet the burden of perpetual vigilance also introduced new anxieties: the ever-present threat of nuclear war, the moral ambiguity of covert operations, and the question of how long such dominance could endure. By the early 1960s, America's position was both triumphant and precarious. The Soviet Union had developed its own nuclear arsenal and was challenging U.S. influence from Berlin to Cuba. Anti-colonial movements in Asia and Africa sought independence on their own terms, not merely as pawns in a superpower contest. At home, the civil rights movement exposed the contradiction between America's democratic ideals and the persistence of racial inequality. The world watched as the self-proclaimed champion of freedom struggled to guarantee that freedom to all its citizens. Yet despite these tensions, the scale of U.S. power remained unprecedented. No previous empire, neither Rome at its height, nor the British Empire, on which the sun famously never set, had combined such economic might, military reach, and cultural influence. America's leaders understood this. They spoke of a Pax Americana, a peace enforced not by conquest, but by a web of alliances, markets, and deterrence. It was a grand experiment, an empire built less on colonies than on consent, less on territorial control than on the irresistible pull of opportunity and security. From the vantage point of the mid-20th century, the trajectory seemed clear. The United States, forged in the crucible of depression and global war, had emerged as the central power of a new world order. Its decisions would shape the fates of nations. Its culture would captivate billions, and its ideals, however imperfectly realized, would inspire movements for democracy across the globe. The eagle, as commentators like to say, had landed. And with its landing, the world had entered an era defined as much by American ambition and imagination as by its armies and industries. The isolationist republic of the early 1900s had become something far larger. A nation empire whose influence reached every continent and whose choices would echo for generations.